Thank you so much for joining. I hope everyone's had a great time so far with day one of HashiConf. It's been a ton of great talks. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to our MCs. I'm super excited to end the day with a few guests who are joining us from Wayfair, who are going to chat about their journey, adopting the tooling from what was their initial drivers through to kind of their journey, what they're doing with it, and where they're hoping to go next. So with that, really excited to welcome both Jeff and Travis from Wayfair. If you guys don't mind, maybe do a quick set of intros just so folks know who you are. Maybe Jeff, if you want to start us off.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name's Jeff Dillon. I've been at Wayfair for the past decade at a bunch of different spots within infrastructure and SRE. At the moment, I'm an associate director on developer platforms and run a few developer enablement teams.
And I'm Travis. I've been at Wayfair for about 5 years or so. I've worked with a variety of our config management components, including Vault, and right now I'm managing our configuration management team.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for joining us and making the time. So maybe before we jump right into sort of the adoption, let's set the scene a little bit. If you don't mind, kind of rewind us back to 2015. I know that was before you went on your cloud adoption journey. Give us a sense of what did Wayfair's infrastructure look like at that time? Jeff, if you don't mind.
Sure. So it was large scale enterprise, but it was physically owned data centers. Large data center on the East Coast, one on the West Coast, one in Europe at the time. And obviously scaling up to that point, it wasn't a constraint. But then as any e-commerce company runs into, we started finding the seams of what we were pressing into on such sales days as Cyber Monday here in the States. So very much physical at that time. No cloud adoption as of yet, but that's when we started toying with the idea.
One, and you mentioned e-commerce. I guess just for the guests who might not know who Wayfair is and what you guys do, actually, if you don't mind, just give a sense of sort of the scale of it and Wayfair's business, because I think that'll help set the stage.
Yes, so Wayfair, all things home, decorative, couches, appliances. In addition to that, we're a technology firm as well. So we have a 3D render suite. We have a artificial reality suite. So always a technologically driven company, but at large scale, all things home for supply chain shipping, for getting things into the door, for just about anything you need for your house.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I think you mentioned and kind of alluded to some of the challenges on things like the scale days, but Travis, I know there was a journey then to move out of private data center, or at least to incrementally adopt cloud. Give us a sense of what was that catalyst? What was the driver for you guys to start to say, hey, we need to do something different than private data center. We think cloud is the right way. What was sort of the driver for that?
Yeah, so the first thing we sort of dipped our toes into is actually trying to solve some of our image problems. You can imagine that with so many products that we sell, we have a lot of images. And that was one of the most difficult systems to scale at the time. So we sort of dipped our toe in the water in the cloud with that in particular, and had really great success through our sort of first big cloud day with stuff in the cloud, sale day with stuff in the cloud. But we really were sold on this ability to scale dynamically during our first Way Day event, where we didn't have a lot of our customer-facing stuff in the cloud yet. We were still sort of just sitting on small things. And the stories that came out of that day, we were shutting down physical infrastructure. We were repurposing whole hypervisors. It was very chaotic in this sort of very tangible sense. And it was after that event that there was, almost no question, we need something that is far more dynamic. And the cloud is obviously where you do that.
And those Way Days, those are kind of similar to like an Amazon Prime Day where you guys are just getting this crazy spike of traffic, I'm guessing.
Yeah, you can think of it that way.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So great elastic scaling, sort of allowing you to, especially with some of these images, move some of that workload over to cloud makes a ton of sense. As you kind of went through that journey of starting to adopt and figure out, great, these are the specific workloads that we can move to cloud, curious where Terraform and Vault started playing a role, because I know both of those were sort of fairly early as part of your adoption journey. So Jeff, maybe if you want to talk to us about, what brought Terraform into that mix.
Yeah, so with that rare opportunity to kind of test out the cloud, we wanted to do it right from the beginning, right? We didn't want to we didn't want to forklift existing human processes. We kind of wanted to figure out the process that's meant for the reality that is the cloud. So that's when we decided Terraform, in addition to that Consul, in addition to that Vault, in addition to that Packer. And we really built the ecosystem that Travis just alluded to the right way from the beginning for the cloud. And after we kind of got the success there and realized almost what we were trying to do on-prem, how almost trivially easy it was to set it up inside GCP or Google Cloud Provider, we kind of did a mind shift there of, okay, we can't have two separate teams. We can't have two separate entities within infrastructure of, I need a cloud thing, talk to these folks. I need a non-cloud thing, talk to these folks. We kind of set out to unify that stack and actually try to see if we could hybridize it.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and I think so. You mentioned a ton of the Hashi tools in there, which we always love to hear. And maybe Travis, you can give us a sense of what was the problem Vault was solving as you were thinking about cloud, and why did that need to come into the mix when it wasn't previously?
Early on in the cloud journey, we were looking at how we manage secrets, and we sort of had this clunky encrypted files with different keys to get things distributed. And when we went to bring that to the cloud, the key handling and the decryption handling, it was unbelievably clunky just to make that happen. So being able to shift that data source to an API that we could then program against in a far more dynamic fashion is what led us to Vault. And because there are a lot of things that Vault has already solved in terms of database access or generating certificates for you and that kind of thing, the future prospects there were really promising. We started really small with Vault. And it took a long time for us to really start to adopt it sort of wholesale and explore a lot more of the features. But it really did get us away from that sort of clunky workflow and led really into a place where we had a lot more freedom and flexibility to get this sort of technical aspect of delivering software out being the secrets.
Makes a lot of sense. And I love the kind of the unifying theme here in some sense of rethinking some of this stuff and doing it in a cloud native way, and kind of that dynamic aspect and how that's different, whether that was the elastic nature of what Terraform was letting you do in terms of kind of scale up, scale down, or the on the credential side with Vault. Jeff, you started talking about this a little bit as you went into cloud, realizing, hey, we don't want two different teams, two different ways of delivering it. As you kind of brought the teams together and said, hey, we want a standard way, did some of the thinking and practices that you adopted in cloud change how you thought about running the private data center, right? Was there a sort of an influence, or did you have just one team, two different processes? How did you kind of think about it?
That's a great question. So we were almost dead set on it has to be a single pipeline. The pipeline has to work because we have 2,000 developers. Just like the process of trying to get the knowledge out there of two separate things was way too complex. So we started building quite a lot of our own providers in-house, just to cook up the pipeline so that as a developer said, I need infrastructure, I need compute, it's the same ingress for them, the same portal, the same HCL code that they submit to the pipeline. And it's basically the providers and the variables that we submit in the back end that decide whether it goes to the physical on-prem data center or up to a Google Cloud data center.
Yeah, and it's a super cool story because I know you guys were sort of on the bleeding edge, in fact, of doing some of this stuff. I remember we were together at your offices doing a meetup group now several years ago where you guys were talking about, here's our unified Terraform pipeline. We can go on-prem with our custom providers we wrote to automate private data center, as well as the providers that take us out to GCP. And I think that was really, really, cutting edge in terms of thinking about modernization of the private data center. So, kind of flashing forward a little bit, right, as you're scaling up your usage of the tools, as you're scaling up sort of the engineering teams to 2,000 people, how did you think about what you needed to do to really enable that sort of scale up?
Yes, so obviously we started with a Terraform open source to kind of give you a hint of where the conversation's going here. And we kind of discovered a constraint that we didn't realize, or at least predict in the beginning, which was, as you scale up, the repetitiveness of HCL code throughout started in itself to become a bottleneck. Not so much as a bottleneck that we could complain about, because we still have the muscle memory of what it was like back in 2015, but of always looking for the constraint in the system and always trying to produce value faster and move faster for the business. We started eyeballing where that next constraint was, and we were almost interested in, is there a way for us to allow developers to get what they need as quickly as possible to serve them, to serve their jobs, and reduce the toil and need of coding on their end.
Right, and I think this is just the classic cycle we see people go through, which is like that step one is how do we enable the teams to at least go to cloud? Step two is like we have that consistent pipeline that you described if we have one way of doing it. But then step three is really starting to think about, okay, how do we do this in a scalable way where we don't have 2,000 developers all reinventing the wheel? And so I know that became sort of a bit of a journey from open source onto some of the commercial products as well. Maybe Travis, if you want to talk about what was that transition for Vault, right? What was the sort of reason and the drivers there?
So we tried sort of early on to manage the open source clusters. That starting small in the cloud, we discovered all kinds of limitations when it came to how small we started, which was surprising that it lasted for as long as it did. And we built out some more robust infrastructure with open source. But there was this sort of reliability and scaling problem that we bumped into that we tried to solve on our own with replicating the data from one place to another. But that started to become really operationally heavy as well, quite quickly, actually. And it was when we did sort of that review, what does it take to grow this? What does it take to get to that next phase? That we really sat down and said, the replication piece of what's in Enterprise, and then adding in the support and the other future features that we know are coming along. That was really the big step for us and the thing that drove us towards Enterprise for Vault.
Yeah, no, and it's it's been funny to watch how many customers I think start that journey of like, how hard could it be to build our own replication? It's like, how hard is a distributed system really? So totally appreciate that journey. Jeff, I know there was a similar, journey on right around maybe the same time for Terraform moving to Terraform Enterprise. Do you want to share a little bit about what that was as well?
Yeah, so it's an interesting story, right? So the history there is we as well internally tried figuring out a way to dynamically create HCL code for Terraform. Do we do inputs? Do we have a form? Do we have a front end? And it was more than one just team that was figuring out, is this a capability? And then we started, re-discussing with HashiCorp, and the attractive part of Terraform Enterprise was the API, which was like a real interesting conversation to have, because it was almost like we were walking into a car dealership and saying, I don't need leather seats, I don't need air conditioning, I care about the engine. The engine is what unblocks us. And what we discovered in our POC that led us to purchase it was let's take a Google Cloud storage bucket, for example, with no other helpers there, multitude of API calls to kind of get it set it up right, get permissions correct, and have it as like out the door prod ready for the developer. The Terraform provider in front of that simplifies those API calls for us, but it's still a multitude of HCL at that moment. What we did was swapping that out with the Terraform Enterprise, we were able to kind of reduce it to an API call with all the parameters we needed. And then Terraform built the bucket for us and came back and sent it back upstream for us. That was the selling point for us. And like I said before, that was the unblocker for us of, I can give a developer a button, or I have a middle layer between that button and Terraform Enterprise. They can submit a YAML file and say, I need these 40 buttons. And the speed that they get feedback and the resources they need to do their jobs is tenfold now.
So yeah, it sounds like it's really starting with the open source on that core enablement, using that to then have that consistent journey across kind of on-prem and cloud. But then really it was the commercial products in terms of how do we scale it up and have a commonality, create an API-driven interface, have these multiple different consumption methods, but also just reduce the reinvention of the wheel, which makes a ton of sense. I guess as you started going down this journey, curious if you started with, hey, we thought there's this initial set of use cases, but then we've started finding other ways we might use products like Vault in ways that maybe weren't what you originally anticipated. Travis, I know you've been doing a lot of work with it. Curious if you found some interesting use cases outside of that initial one.
Yeah, so the initial replacement of this clunky sort of YAML base to let's use Vault as just a secure backend. We know we can put everything in there. It's still sort of key value based. We'll go from there. But as we started to get more into the cloud and more of this dynamic nature, really the Terraform tooling that got built up around it, we needed a way to distribute secrets beyond just the VMs that we were building. We couldn't keep sort of the same interface that we were running anymore. We now had things that were running in Kubernetes, and we were adjusting our CI/CD pipelines and where those were running. And with the adoption of containers, developers were starting to do a lot more local development than just in sort of shared VMs. So this really led us to go, how can we enable Vault to distribute to all of these different places? And we set up sort of a taxonomy for ourselves of how we describe different interactions with Vault. And we built out almost an entire sort of internal algorithm to say anything that is in Vault, we can then get distributed in a unified fashion to any place that might need that secret, including the things like approvals and checks and that sort of stuff. So that's really where this journey became fascinating, because now all of a sudden, wherever you are, your secret pathway is very well defined and incredibly consistent.
Yeah, it's super interesting to see that, how it started with just, hey, let's do the key values, solve this immediate problem, and then kind of branching out to, hey, what about the developer environments? What about the dynamic credentials? And I think what we often see is Vault sort of like an iceberg. People start at the very tip of it, where it's like, oh yeah, I just have the secret management piece, but it's it's all that capability below the surface that, I think is where you kind of dig into as you get deeper in the journey. Maybe just to wrap us up, Jeff, I know you guys have made a ton of progress and are really mature now in this kind of cloud journey. Give us a sense of where you're going. Where are you now taking the platform? What's kind of the frontier for you?
Yeah, so we are moving fully into Google Cloud, which is interesting, right? Because the journey that we set out 4 or 5 years ago, where it was just the first toe in the pool, kind of brought about to where we are in the current daytime. And I think the story kind of flows in that we brought in Terraform and Vault and those tools originally as infrastructure people, as a way to kind of simplify our jobs. But as I've managed the past couple of years, I almost realized it doesn't really simplify my job. It helps simplify the developer jobs. So one of the areas that we're really concentrating on the next year is like a large scale enterprise platform as a service layer within everything. So to give you kind of like a sneak preview, if you, Armon, were a developer and you started within Wayfair, the dream is like, hey, you come in and we have an open source front end UI, Backstage. Behind that, we have kind of a middle layer that we wrote ourselves in Golang, our governance layer. But then that talks directly to Terraform Enterprise. And then Terraform Enterprise talks directly to Google Cloud. So you don't have to write HCL. You don't have to talk to other teams. We can set up SOC compliance around it. You can deploy to prod and deploy to dev, hopefully as quickly as you can code your app to head out in that direction. We have it tied into Kubernetes. We have it tied into Kafka. We have it tied into Aerospike to cache. The goal is, I think now, to speed up the developers, give in my mind, they are my customer at Wayfair.
No, it makes a ton of sense. I mean, I think that's ultimately the end goal of infrastructure, right? It's ultimately plumbing. We're just here to enable the developers, enable the application development teams to go faster. And so it makes sense. They're the customer, and the end goal is let's make them super productive. So I'm excited about what you guys are building and excited to get to partner on it. And hopefully you'll join us for next year at HashiConf and share where that platform development has gone. But in the meantime, thank you both so much for making the time and joining us here today. With that, I hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you so much again to Jeff and Travis. And I'm going to hand it back to our excellent MCs to close out the day.